Alright, so we need to start solving some radical equations. Note that a lot of what we're doing is going to feel like the Algebra 1 steps. Add 2 to both sides, subtract 2 from both sides, multiply 2 from both sides, so on and so forth. Except now we have this extra thing showing up in our equations. A square root, perhaps a cube root. In order to undo something, we need inverse operations. So the inverse of multiplication is division. The inverse of subtraction is addition. The inverse of a square root, in other words, how do I get rid of a square root? Well, we just need to square both sides. Squaring both sides of an equation undoes a square root, because the square root of x squared, well, that square root and square, they just cancel. Just like if this were an x plus 2, subtracting 2 from both sides would cancel off that plus 2. So square roots and squares cancel, leaving me with an x on the left. And on the right, I have 2 squared. In other words, 2 times 2. 2 times 2 is just 4. So this is going to feel very much like Algebra 1. You have an equation. As long as you do the same thing to both sides, you're good. With a cube root, we do want to be careful because a square and a cube root, those don't cancel. So instead of squaring both sides, we'd want to cube both sides. So it's no more difficult than the previous one. We just need to remember we're raising it to a different exponent. So the cube root of y cubed, just like before, those are going to cancel, the cube and the cube root, leaving us with just the y. And then 8 cubed is 512. So of course in Algebra 1, we didn't stick around with just one-step equations for very long. Eventually we moved up to 2-step, 3-step, so on and so forth. So one last example in this video. Note that there's kind of a lot going on here. I've got some multiplication. I do have the square root. I also have that plus 3. So before you square both sides, or if we're talking about a cubic equation, cubing both sides, before you do that, we want to isolate the radical. Note that this is my radical, the square root of x. I want to get that by itself before I square. If I square both sides of this equation right now as my first step, then I'm going to have this whole left side squared. And that's a mess. We will eventually do problems like that where you have to square more than just one term, but we're not quite there yet. So get that radical by itself using our Algebra 1 methods. Instead of a plus 3, we can do minus 3. That cancels off that plus 3 on the left. 15 take away 3 is 12. And we can get rid of this 4 in front of the radical. Right now it's 4 times the radical. The opposite of times is divide. (12) divided by 4 is going to be 3. Now you are in the same situation as the very left example here. We've got a radical. That radical equals 3. To undo that square root, we just square both sides. Three squared will be 9. So far, all 3 of these radicals just had a variable under them. Square root of x, cube root of y, square root of x. This one had more stuff outside of the radical. We had a coefficient. We also had that constant term 3. We do want to take a look at some examples where the radical does have other stuff with it. Maybe it's an x minus 1, an x minus 2. But take a look at these examples, especially this last one here. Make sure you understand the flow, because most of this is Algebra 1. All that's new here is just getting rid of the radical. Before moving on, we want to make sure we're comfortable with just that idea, because afterwards we're going to add a few more steps after squaring both sides. So definitely raise your hand if you have a question. Let me know if you need any supports.